Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dr. Cheryl Finely, and I welcome you this afternoon to join me with Dr. Lee Rayford. And I'm really excited to have this conversation today. Lee has just joined us, and I'm welcoming you, Lee, to come on and have a conversation with me today. We'll be talking about art education and the future of democracy. And my name is Dr. Cheryl Finley, and I am the inaugural director of TIF. And I would like to extend a big thank you to Lauren Harris. And hi, Lee. How are you?
Hi,
Welcome.
Cheryl. Hi,
Great to
everyone.
see you. Good morning. I know it's early
Morning.
there for you.
I
Um,
got my coffee.
Yay! Coffee. So I just want to extend warm thanks to the AUCR collective team, to Lauren Harris, to Rachel Brown, to our students, teaching faculty in the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College, and to the Alice L. Walton Foundation for their generous support. The AUCR Collective, that is who we are, and we're the first and only undergraduate program designed to be a pipeline for African Americans to transform the art industry. We operate from the largest HBCU consortium in the United States at the Atlanta University Center, from Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College. So with that, I welcome Dr. Lee Rayford, who is an associate professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley, a longtime friend and colleague, world traveler, and we're going to have a great conversation today. Lee, welcome.
Thanks, Cheryl. I just also want to say that I wore this in honor of our trip to Dakar 4 years
Nice,
ago.
nice. So we were there working together with another of our colleagues, Dr.
Mhm.
Heike Rafael Hernandez, who is a professor of American Studies at the University of Würzburg in Germany. And we were at Dakar, and this is an even year. And typically we would be expecting to be at Dakar just
That's
about
right.
now, right?
That's right.
Which is the contemporary art fair that takes place every 2 years on the even year in Dakar, Senegal. So
Mhm.
it's an art fair that focuses on contemporary African art. Yeah, thank you for wearing that. All right. So I just wanted to maybe just begin with a little bit of, a background. We met some years ago
Mhm.
when we were in graduate school. We were at Yale University in the interdisciplinary program in African American Studies. You were studying American Studies. I was in the History of Art department. And I wanted to maybe just begin by asking you to talk about how that was a really heady time, I think, in the
Mhm.
mid 1990s when we were there studying together. We were really interested in questions about photography, about history, about the photographic image and its relationship
Mhm.
to memory, and how we might call upon it to tell stories about, specifically about Black history, about women's history.
Mhm.
And I just thought maybe we could begin there as we have a conversation
Sure.
today.
Yeah. I think for me, um, thinking about how the histories of the civil rights movement and Black Power, how they got passed down to those of us who were born in the aftermath of those movements or in the wake of those movements, who didn't experience them directly, but all of whose life choices were made
Right.
possible by those movements. And for me, I thought about um, the power of photography and the power of images in conveying that history. And so I wanted to my own work spent time trying to unpack those how stories get told through photography. And so my dissertation that turned into my first book look specifically at how African American social movement organizers utilized photography as a weapon of choice, as one of many tools or weapons in their arsenal.
Or
Um,
we could say a choice of weapons, if we
A
want
choice
to
of
give
weapons.
give a
Yes.
shout out to Gordon Parks,
Yes.
one of the greats of African American photography, of American photography.
Mm-hmm. And what I was really, actually, I did not talk about or write about Gordon Parks in that project as an independent photographer, as an arts photographer. I was interested in in the ways that photography became embedded in movements, right? Became part of a movement strategy.
Right.
So the ways in which the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for example, trained and hired photographers as part of their organizing groups. The way they set up dark rooms in various locations, the way they developed the role of communication secretary, which Julian Bond took on in SNCC, and then Kathleen Cleaver during her time in SNCC saw that role as being liaison to the media, as hiring photographers, as marshaling writers, as creating a public image for those organizations. And she took that role and created it for herself when she joined the Black Panther Party.
Exactly. And so the title of your first book, which comes from your dissertation, is Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare: Photography in the African American Civil Rights Struggle. Oh, you could. You have a copy?
I think I have a copy of it. It's so funny. We were talking last night, and it's, in shelter in place, everybody sort of kind of like, we had to kind of abandon our offices, and so you grab whatever books you have. So at least I have a copy of my own book in my house, because that would be embarrassing if I did not.
Yes.
But I have to lean down for it.
And I have to say, just looking behind you, yes, here it is, Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare. And I hope that we can also look at some images from the book and talk about how the book is organized. And this is your brainchild of some years ago. You've also worked on other projects as well. I did just want to give a shout out to Dr. Mary Schmidt-Campbell, president of Spelman College. And we'll note behind Dr. Rayford is product placement of her phenomenal An American Odyssey.
Really amazing book.
Which is the definitive biography of one of the great African American artists, Romare Bearden. Please go on out and get that. I see Liz. Liz is on the call with us today. We've got a lot of folks joining us today. Thank you so much. Please note
shout out to also my parents and my brother, who are sheltering in place in Atlanta, and my brother, who is a proud Morehouse graduate.
You're frozen.
Oh, uh-oh.
Okay.
Am I here? Okay?
Yeah, you're here.
Okay.
So you said your brother is, you were starting to say, and I think I missed that.
My brother is a proud Morehouse alum.
All right. That's great. That's great. Well, welcome. Family is in the house. Atlanta's in the house. All right. So we were talking about Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare. And I wanted to know if you could maybe mention Kathleen Cleaver. We started out talking about, when I was kind of playing around with your choice of words, as in a choice of weapons, talking about the work of Gordon Parks. And we can maybe think about his work as it might relate to your larger project, which looks at maybe 2 decades later, but his work through the Farm Security Administration, which was also a very different kind of, and brand of social movement photography. But who are some of the key players that you discuss in your book, and what are some of the key images that really drove you to take upon this project?
Sure. So just an overview of the book. I start with Ida B. Wells's anti-lynching campaigns in the 1890s and early 20th century, and then specifically focus on the NAACP's drive for anti-lynching legislation, which there still is no anti-lynching legislation, and we know from the recent murder of Ahmaud Arbery that it's much needed. But I was interested in the ways that those organizers, those activists, used lynching photographs as part of their campaigns. Those images are generally, the photographers are mostly unnamed, but the lynching photograph really held sway for so many photographers, so many activists. And so in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we see a number of photographers who kind of return to those images, and in the Black Panther Party as well. So some of the photographers I talk about are Danny Lyon. I was really moved by his poster that he created, Come Let Us Build a New World Together, that has John Lewis at its, is one of the people featured in that image.
Can you show us the image?
You know, the funny part is I actually don't know that I have, I was looking for it. I actually don't have a version of it. That's a whole other story about rights and permissions that we could or could not get into.
Right. Okay.
But one of the things I love about that image, there are two things that I love about that image. One is that at the center of it is a young girl, a 12-year-old girl who, in the photograph was taken during a sit-in or protest of a segregated pool in Cairo, Illinois. And the image features John Lewis and this young girl and another male activist kneeling in prayer in preparation for this action they're about to take. And they look almost like runners at the start line, right? They look like they are bracing for a race. And then
it's such an iconic image, Lee. I think that many of us, we know this image, we have it in our mind's eye. And I think that, that we can even recall it in more recent times when we look at, the work of activists who are athletes who have, taken to kneeling in protest. So it's one that's how I, in more recent times, I've recalled that image in my mind's eye. And I think for younger generations, Neil Gradstein, who's going to be joining us at Morehouse, one of our early college program inaugural cohort from last summer, the summer of 2019, he's on the call today. And I think that when I think about some of the ways that we engage our students in the classroom, through our curatorial work, through using interdisciplinary methods. I know that you often work with poetry and literature and music, that sometimes, while I might have danced to Parliament Funkadelic, at a concert, when I was a younger person, I know that, many of my students are going to be listening to Funkadelic through something that was mixed and, and tapped by a DJ or something like that. So just thinking about the way that these images move and morph through time and how they become relatable is really, I think, an important consideration. Absolutely.
I think what's also great about that photograph is there's a Black girl at the center, which reminds us of the central role of Black women and children in the civil rights movement. And I love that it's not an image of contestation or sorry, still early in California, of police violence, right? Which is also one of the ways that those images really circulate, and the vulnerability of Black people and Black bodies, but reminding us of the kind of quiet and stillness that is required of activism, that's required to kind of steel yourself up to do this work.
Right. It's almost a meditative moment. Like when I look at that image, it reminds me of, the mindfulness practices that many of us engage in today. There's a mindfulness meditation that's going on right now, I know, through one of my colleagues at Spelman right now at the noon hour on Thursdays. But it's one of those kinds of images that, that calls up, as you said, the still, the quiet, the reserve that one needs to build up in order to be able to be in fighting position. And that's like an intellectual fighting position, right?
it's an intellectual fighting position. It's an embodied fighting position, right? It's a spiritual fighting position, all of that. And then just the text, right? So the transformation of these images into posters that were used as fundraising tools for the organization. And it's an invitation. Come, let us build a new world together. And I hold on to that phrase constantly. Like, just, I come back to that. What does it
gives
mean?
me goosebumps right now.
It does.
When I think about the moment in which we're living, and and the tools that we're going to have to harness, that we will need. It's a very prescient image and a prescient thought. Come, let us build a new world together.
It is, and I think that is, writing, and there's so many folks here who have, I'm seeing who work I admire, who have written on, who curated, who thought about these really difficult histories and difficult images, and it's hard to write to do this work sometimes, this scholarly work. And, SNCC in many ways were, ended up being in many ways some of the heroes of my project, because there was always the commitment to the beloved community, to, being and bringing your best self, whatever that may be on any given day,
right, to
the struggle. And this, and again, this sort of vision of wanting to create something new. And so actually, I know this is going to be a little awkward. Let's see. This is my first IG live. So let me see if I can make this work.
You got it, Lee.
Okay, here we go.
Yay.
There we go.
Oh,
so
thank
it
you.
is. Yeah. So that's the image there.
And we can all see it. Thank you. That's perfect. Thank you.
So, and I think about also how SNCC, Freedom Summer, the beloved community as models have shaped subsequent social movements, and specifically during Occupy, about 10 years ago, sort of Occupy's model of mutual aid, of building a community for, Dr. Deb Willis asked to show the image again.
Oh, so thank you.
Yes. So, but that model of, of both, of at once voter engagement, but literacy programs, of community structures, and really, that then you have that the Black Panthers take up, in, if the state won't take care of us, right, we build for ourselves. Right. And so I'm just really, really moved. And I come back to this poster. I think I come back to this poster more than I imagined I would.
Another thing that the poster makes me think about, which you've already referenced, is again, sort of this interplay between image and text. And also the work that Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare does through bringing these stories to the fore that most people, when they might recognize an image from the civil rights era, from the work of SNCC, from the work of the Black Power Party, for example, these images are often ones that have come to us historically through the news media, through a front page of a newspaper, or even buried within a newspaper. And I think that by you telling this story about how these images actually often were used for alternative purposes, for fundraising, for thinking about what the movement could do in order to empower people, to enable people to have the ability to vote, to have a voice in their own communities. That's a really important story to continue to tell, especially when we are confronting the election over this coming summer and into the fall, and the way that we really have to think about different kinds of methods to get out the vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that at the heart of my project was trying to understand Black representation in both the political sense and the cultural sense, and that those two things are not unrelated. They are
Right.
deeply, deeply tied to one another. And so the need to tell our own stories, to image ourselves as we need to be, as we would like to be seen, and to represent ourselves politically as well, right? Those are all, that was all part of the work that SNCC was engaged in, that the NAACP and Ida B. Wells were engaged in, that the Black Panther Party was engaged in. And so, you know, and I think up until, you know, as I was working on this project in the 90s, people often, or at least scholarship, wanted to understand, you know, understand politics and culture as two completely different realms. And we know, and again, I'm looking at all of the folks who are kind of finding, you know, joining us here. This is a conversation that all of you are engaged in, that we're having powerfully, you know, powerfully presenting your own work and ideas around this. And so I think this is, so this, you know, continues to be a really important question for me.
Right. And I think just, you know, talking about the people who've joined us, James Leventhal is there with you on the West Coast. And also Dr. Deb Willis. We know she's here with us on the East Coast, and someone whose work that we admire and respect. Absolutely. And whose leadership we really we are just so happy to be, I think, the children of, in many ways, the sisters of, I will say. But also to look at Dr. Courtney Baker is on with us today, and just to think about, you know, these different voices and different ways intersectionally we can have a conversation about this work and the work that it can do. I wanted to ask if you could say something more about some of the photographers in the book. Sure. There was an image that, very famous image, the vote image that we used to advertise your talk today. If there are any other works of photographers you might want to signal.
You know, there are a few people. So the image we used today was Bruce Davidson, the Magnum photographer, and one of my that I don't talk about that image in the book, but Sarah Lewis in the Aperture Vision and Justice issue spent some time with that really powerfully. But I love Bruce Davidson's another image of a Black woman being arrested in front of the movie marquee. I don't know if you can, here we go, this image. And in the background, right, the movie marquee says suspense, excitement, Susan Hayward's Backstreet and Damn the Defiant. And I love the kind of the announcement, right? The drama of the protest. But I also really, I think another one of my absolute favorites on the facing page is Charles Moore, who was he was a news photographer in Birmingham. But I never quite know what the title of this image is. I just always called it Chant Down Babylon. Like that's how I think about it. Chant Down Babylon.
Right, right.
You know, Saidiya Hartman might think about it as call it the chorus, right? But it is this, you know, the sort of the joy in the struggle, the joy in the confrontation, the joy in the togetherness, and this woman with her, you know, with her dress, and her jewelry, right, and her white dress that is like the counterpoint to the police, you know, is really phenomenal. But I think some of the other photographers, as I mentioned, Danny Lyon was key, but SNCC trained a whole host of people who came to the movement and didn't necessarily come to the movement as photographers, but kind of found their way into the movement or into the struggle, and found their contribution through photography. So people like Julius Lester, who had many different kinds of contributions to the movement as a writer, as a musician, as an archivist. Tamiya Wakayama, who was a Japanese Canadian photographer. Dr. Doris Derby from Atlanta, who actually was part of the Free Southern Theater and some of the other Freedom Summer initiatives, but
So,
also made photographs.
do you see the note your parents would like for you to reference the page that you were just on, please?
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, for my parents following along at home, this is page 82, 83 are those images.
Thank you.
Thanks. And so thinking about, and so a lot of, and then also, well, let me see, I'm going to move things around a little bit, but there was a photographer named Matt Herron.
Oh, yeah.
And so this is a work that he actually gifted me when I was doing interviews for the book. It's an image he made in Bogalusa, Louisiana in 1965. And I also, you can see I have I'm definitely on theme here. I Black women at the center of all the photographs, and especially sort of, singing or just sort of as the kind of central force of an image.
It's a powerful image.
It's phenomenal. So Matt Herron was a formally trained photographer who helped train other photographers in SNCC and set up dark rooms. He also created something called the Southern Documentary Project, which was organized around on the model of the Farm Security Administration photographs. He'd been a student of Dorothea Lange's, and so really wanted to try and encourage a slower form of documentary photography making. Rather than a kind of photojournalism. And Matt Herron helped me understand better the different roles that photographers played and the different ways photographers use their cameras, the kind of patience of the eye, whether it was movement photographs made in service to the movement itself, or they were photojournalistic images, or they were more social documentary images, and that in a sense, the different kinds of breath it takes, right, to look through a camera with each of those different intentions. And so that helped me understand a little bit more what was at stake.
Dr. Kelly Jones just joined us.
Hello, Dr. Kelly. Oh, here.
Liz Andrews here. Yay!
I did also one of the key books and
powerful
exhibitions that helped me think through what's at stake in art and politics in the civil rights era. Thank you, Dr. Kelly Jones.
Thank you for that exhibition and book. Thank you so much. Yes. So what you were saying also reminds me, Lee, of just the way that when you talk about Herron and his role as not only being a photographer, but someone who was on the ground, who really wanted to set up this model where other young photographers or would-be photographers or other young people who are engaged in the same kind of social movement work and charge, that there's this collaboration that's going on. And so it's a model that enables different groups to be able to harness the power of photography in order to move the movement forward. And I wanted to maybe shift with that point that you made to talk about Freedom Summer, right?
Yeah.
To maybe shift and talk about what was Freedom Summer. What is the course that you are proposing to teach this summer about Freedom Summer, and how might we be able to use, what you're sharing with us? Again, you're a teacher, you're an educator, in order to think about how we mobilize this summer in order to make a difference this fall and in the coming generations for our children.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I am, well, for, many people know, but Freedom Summer 1964 was an initiative organized
1964.
by I love that year. Organized by SNCC and CORE, that was meant to brought nearly 1,000 college students to the South to engage in voter registration, but also in literacy programs. It also initiated, the Freedom Singers, the Free Southern Theater, a whole host of initiatives. But what was incredibly powerful, so part of the idea also was that even though Black folks had been doing voter registration and civil rights activism, by bringing middle class white college students to the South, that it would turn a light on the violence, the precarity, the vulnerability of the work of what people were engaged in, and it would turn the kind of moral compass and the sense of national empathy towards this struggle. Mm-hmm. And it was that movement enabled or hastened the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. But for me as a faculty member at UC Berkeley, so much of our history on that campus is also tied to Freedom Summer, because one of the activists who participated in Freedom Summer, Mario Savio, would return to Berkeley campus in the fall of 1964, completely kind of radicalized and motivated by his experiences in Mississippi, and would help found the free speech movement in his work alongside really hotel workers in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. But we know now that that of course, as soon as Freedom Summer, as soon as the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, became the sort of the retrenchment, right? The work to undo it, which really sort of solidified in advance of the 2016 election, when South Carolina, when the Supreme Court officially sort of struck down the remaining parts of the Voting Rights Act. And so we actually entered the 2016 election with no Voting Rights Act in place. And we've seen, and so, I think we have to understand that voter suppression is an ongoing, is one of the ongoing fights. And
can I just give a shout out to what our colleagues at the CAU Art Museum? They just joined. So hi, Diamond and Marita. I don't know if that's TK and Nzinga, but hello, we're happy that you're here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just not to interrupt, but I think that there's also a connection. I also just want to, uplift the work that we did last week with Jessica Ingram's book, Road Through Midnight, especially thinking about, how so many people, Vernon Damer was one of the people that we spoke of, especially in her book, really, worked so hard for voter registration drives, for voting rights, and who lost their lives in the act of doing so. So that's, just kind of bringing a through line and thread through some of the work that we're doing in these conversations.
Absolutely. I mean, Vernon Damer, Viola Liuzzi was a white activist who lost her life during Freedom Summer. And of course, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, who were disappeared at the beginning of Freedom Summer, and then whose bodies were found at the end of that year. And so, when our elders say, like, I gave my life for you to vote, that's not a notion.
No,
that's
not
real.
A notion. It's not a notion at all.
And
Charles Hall just joined us, an artist based in Montreal, Washingtonian, a longtime childhood friend, studied with Terry Atkins, and University of Pennsylvania. Glad you're here, Charlie.
Um, and I think it really struck me in the fall of 2018, when I watched what was happening in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, and the way that Brian Kemp was actively engaged in removing people from the voter rolls, right? So over the course of 4 years, Brian Kemp oversaw the cancellation of 1.5 million voters from the Atlanta rolls, and the fear that, and we're seeing this over and over again, the fear of especially Republicans that that people voting will vote them out of office, right? The fear that full democracy is a threat to their power,
and also the multiple modes that are now in discussion about how can we vote, amidst the pandemic. Do we mail in? Do we go online to do our I think I was talking to my mother this morning, in fact, and she said she was able to go online and do her mail-in ballot, but not everyone knows how to do that. How do we educate people?
Well, and it's no accident then as well that that the Postal Service, the U.S. Postal Service is being so defunded, right?
Yes.
So sort of, and it's kind of a kind of a perfect storm, because it's also, we also know that the Postal Service is one of the largest employers of Black and brown
people,
folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Freedom Summer class is actually the brainchild of my colleague Saru Jayarahman, who is a phenomenal activist and organizer. She's a lawyer. And she is also the founder of an organization called One Fair Wage, which initially began in the aftermath of 9/11 to support Windows on the World workers who had lost their jobs. Uh-oh, I lost Cheryl.
I know, what happened? Am I back?
Maybe we're just looking at your ceiling.
Why? That's weird.
Well, I'll keep talking, and then you're going to come back in. It'll be great. So they had, so she organized this organization. Oh, here we go. I see your window. To support Windows on the World workers, and so this organization developed into One Fair Wage, which is about raising wages and working conditions for people in the restaurant industry, right? So tipped workers. And we know that 1 in 10 Americans currently work in the restaurant industry, right? It is the second largest and fastest growing industry in the United States, but it's absolutely the lowest paid, right? The lowest paid workers. So there was no, even when the minimum wage, a federal minimum wage was instituted in 1938, the tipped workers were exempted, right?
And it was never enough. It's still not enough.
And still not enough. So I mean, I think the minimum wage for people in the restaurant industry or for tipped workers is something like $2.13 an hour, right? So we know also that the most affected people, right, who work in this industry are people of color, are women of color, single parents, right? So this is an industry that was folks were already in crisis before the pandemic, but have been really thrown into sort of catastrophic crisis, right?
And so your course has just been posted, Lee.
Oh, great. Excellent.
Yeah.
So Saru had this brilliant idea to organize originally a 2-part course that would send 50 students to Michigan, 50 students to Pennsylvania, to engage in nonpartisan voter registration in these 2 battleground states. alongside and as they were doing this organizing, they would be taking a social movements history and theory course. Of course, the pandemic hit. It was like, no way, we're not sending anybody anywhere, right? And so I was feeling like most people, super depleted, and we can't do this. And Saru was like, no, actually, we can make this bigger than before, because everybody is sort of organizing voter registration game was dependent on knocking door to door, right? Door to door canvassing. And nobody has a kind of phone or digital game. But now what Freedom Summer is doing is we still have the class. So social movement theory and organizing, and
who can register?
And you can register. This is for high school students and college students. It's a summer school class, so you get credits through UC Berkeley. But if you also just want to volunteer to work with One Fair Wage, you can do that as well. And it's but that what the work then is doing is that folks will be working with, well, let me back up a little bit. So in the pandemic, as soon as the pandemic started, One Fair Wage created a $20 million cash relief fund to tipped workers, and 170,000 restaurant workers have signed up for relief with One Fair Wage. They've come to One Fair Wage to get help. And those are, sort of unlikely voters, right? Mm-hmm. They are people who are generally hard to reach.
Right.
And
because they're working.
Because they're working.
When the polls are open.
Right. Exactly. And here is, so One Fair Wage has the opportunity now, instead of having to go out and seek these seek potential voters, right? They've got a pool of 170,000 people who are willing and able to be activated. And so the course, you take the course, and then alongside you will learn digital and phone voter registration and peer-to-peer organizing strategies. And I have to say that
it's fantastically.
It's just, I am so excited. I'm sort of the bureaucrat in the Department of African American Studies that's working on the logistics of this. And I think, like most people, it's been really hard to get your head back in the game and to kind of feel like any of the work that we're doing, what matters in this moment. Well, and this is, something that I can point to that I feel incredibly proud about, that feels that, what does efficacy look like? What does it look like to actually feel like we're taking a hand in our democracy, taking a hand in our future in a way, in the light of the fact that, we can't gather, we can't protest, or we can't, we can't participate in rallies, right. We can't be side by side.
And you can't just, right, and you can't just sit at home and eat.
And you can't just, right, and wring your hands.
Or do endless Zooms. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask, because that's kind of been many of our lives since we've all been sheltering in place. So can anyone sign up for the class? That's one question. Mm-hmm. The other question is, how might it be different? You've talked about some of the tools that you're going to teach in terms of, voter registration, in terms of thinking about how, how do you go out and organize? What are the principles of community organizing? But how are the students in your course then able to take this material and activate it? Is there going to be a component where, even though we are not meant to be interacting with other people, that there are assignments that enable some sort of experiential interaction with others to spread the word?
Right. So one day a week is the course, the social movement course, and then 8 to 10 hours a week will be volunteering with One Fair Wage. and learning these skills and putting them into practice.
Okay.
So speaking with, some of these 170,000 tipped waged workers who are, and hopefully, passing on the skills, organizing skills to them as
Okay.
well. But we're also still like, this is all new to us too. So we're trying to figure out, how do we create more opportunities within the Zoom classroom for connection, conversation, and the like. But what is great about the class at this point is that, before it was sort of really going to be localized to the 100 students who we were sending to these various places. But now we have the opportunity for people to come from, all over, from any of the 50 states, any schools that are interested. So it's open to anyone. It's a summer school course, so there is a fee attached to it if you want the course portion of it. But again, if you just want to volunteer and work with one fair wage, you can do that as well. And that's also a great opportunity. And I just to say also, I have learned so much working with Saru just in the past few months. And so just the opportunity to be able to take a class with her, I think for any sort of young or emerging organizer, it's a really phenomenal opportunity.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Saru. And just in terms of teaching and courses, I wanted to say that one of the elements of our program, of the AUC Art Collective's program, is our early college program for high school students, which we're running for the second time this summer. We'll have a cohort of 16 students from around the country. And these are rising juniors and seniors in high school. And also we have a student who's participating from abroad as well. It's a fully funded program. And like your course, we're taking this online. It's in partnership with the High Museum of Art. And it's really interesting to kind of think about, how do you take something that's meant to be active, where you're, whether you're organizing and you're going from door to door, or whether you're teaching a class about museum studies, and you want to be in front of or around art objects. How do you actually change that around? And so we're working, as I mentioned before, with our partners at the High, with Professor Bernita Webb-Bender at Spelman College, Lauren Harris, our program coordinator, and other people in and around Atlanta to make this program a reality. But one of the really cool things that ties to your work is that we use this really, really foundational collection at the High Museum of Civil Rights Photography. Mm-hmm. And so one of the capstone projects for students in this early college program is to work with this collection and to do an exhibition. So we'll be seeing how they activate this collection in, I think, a different way. Innovation is another key part of what our program is all about as well. So, yeah, yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things I love about the program, and I had the opportunity to visit Spelman, I guess, at the very beginning of February, and talk to the incredible students who are part of the program. Yes. And, it's just like what you're doing is so special and so amazing. And I think what's exciting is that you've managed to think about access differently, right? These conversations, the program that you're doing, the early college program. But I think it's, one of the things we've been talking about too, is just sort of thinking about what do we get to change in this moment? Mm-hmm. What are how does it force us to rethink all of our practices in so many ways? And so how does it force us to rethink the museum and access to art and our relationship to art and who it belongs to? And, and I think, and already the AUC Art Collective was engaged in exactly that work, right? Saying that this field needs to be much broader and it needs to be open to so many more people. But thinking about then what what these kinds of what the digital actually can open up for us in thinking about, thinking about access.
Right. And what technology can open up. So I'm going to just say one announcement, Lee. I don't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no.
And then I want to pivot to a question that's been posed. And then I'm going to go back, maybe depending on how much time we have. We have exactly 9 minutes and a number of seconds left before we get cut. So the question is, can you comment on how MLK's photographer, Ernest Withers, turned out to be an FBI informant?
Oh, yes. Okay, well, first, I have to say I
met him.
That he was not in my book, because those revelations came out just when the book came out, and I was like, oh my God. So for people who don't know, right, it turns out that for at least 4 years, Ernest Withers, who's called the original civil rights photographer, and was made some of the most intimate photographs of Martin Luther King.
But also some of his best known work, of course, is from the Emmett Till murder.
Right, from the Emmett Till trial. He had been a paid FBI informant. And I think, a lot of great writing about this. Dr. Deb Willis has talked about this. My thoughts on this, one, is that, first of all, we know that many photographers were pressed into service by not only the FBI, but by local police agencies. And this sort of came up a lot in my research, that photographers were being asked or compelled to give over their photographs to local police agencies to help identify activists. And we know this to be true, of this moment, right? The ways in which our digital images are being conscripted or what have you for surveillance.
Right.
But also, exactly, right?
We're here.
For those of you who don't know, your Zooms are recorded, right? It's not a private.
Even if you don't push record, they are recorded. That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I think that going back to what I was saying earlier about Matt Herron and the different ways that photographers engage the image or engage practices, I think that, I always ask myself, well, what if Ernest Withers became a better photographer? His eye was made sharper in a weird way by knowing that he was photographing for multiple images, right? Because we already know that photography is not just a tool of representing, our best selves, but it's also a tool of surveillance, right? It's a tool of projection. So I think, there are many ways we can think about it. I think we can, I do fall on in line with Dr. Willis's, contention that, we can't dismiss all of the images. We can't, get rid of him, or, I don't want to cancel Ernest Withers, right, because of these images, but I think we need to think broadly about what the role of the civil rights photographer is, and think broadly about, what those images were for, and what kind of structures are in place that, that pressed him into service, in the first instance.
So you're saying we don't know what they were holding over his head?
Well, we kind of do a little bit. Ernest Withers was like one of the first Black cops in Memphis. He actually was dismissed from probably for taking bribes. He had 7 kids and was trying to take care of his family. But he also, there's also a sense that also that the civil rights movement wasn't necessarily, it wasn't an underground movement in the way that the Black Panther Party was, right? So there's also a sense of what was their, kind of what was he revealing, right? In a sense. So I think, there, so I think there's like, we do kind of know what they were holding, but there's
Right.
also, the case of, I can't remember, Earl Caldwell versus, who was brought before the Supreme Court, because he was being asked, or he was being forced to submit his photographs of the Black Panthers. So, recognizing that, right, this question, the power of surveillance, Tobacco Brown says, right, the power of surveillance are in the making of American history. It's kind of, it's not, those images aren't, how do I want to say it? They're not pure, right? They're not, and so it's the question of use. One place, though, that Deb and I had the privilege of visiting in Memphis a few years ago, was the Ernest Withers Museum, with where his family has kept his legacy alive. And so also just thinking about, what role that played in the longer trajectory of his career. And it is complex and it's really hard, but also I think, he deserves a little bit of, again, I don't want to cancel Ernest Withers.
Yeah, no, I don't think you can. You cannot cancel Ernest Withers. I remember meeting him when I was doing research for my first book in Memphis years and years ago as an older man. And if we think about, for example, his photographs of the sanitation workers' strikes and, the power of, that I am a man placard that we now know selling for thousands of dollars at auctions in New York and elsewhere, but also being reactivated by the work of Hank Willis Thomas and his sort of play on words with the I am a man placard. I want to shift in the last approximately 2 minutes that we have, Lee. So this is going to be a quick shift just to kind of turn the conversation to care. And when you talked about what Ernest Withers' family has done for him and for his legacy, yesterday you posed some fundamental questions. And I'm going to quote you here. You said, "What form does care take when we care for our communities, our neighborhoods, each other, or actually feeling that you can use all the tools at your disposal to make positive changes in your community?" Could you reflect on that with maybe just about 1-2 minutes?
Sure. I guess the things that I've been thinking a lot about, finishing up the semester teaching Christina Sharp's In the Wake and Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, thinking about the role, how important care is to challenging our this moment, and not just on a national level and whatever we sort of people's feelings are about national politics, but how important it is to start from very sort of ever widening circles of the local. So thinking about mutual aid, do we know our neighbors? How do we take care of them? How do we feed each other? How do we make sure that we're okay? How do we,
how do we check in?
How do we check in? How do we, take care of ourselves as well? Like, I showered today. There we go.
Me too. Yeah. But exactly. And thinking about even like the larger, issue that's affecting us in terms of healthcare, not only nationally and locally, in small pockets and communities globally, but also the work that healthcare workers are doing now, the people who are, on the front lines and the first responders with this question of care. We've got
and that's what curating is, right? It's also a practice of care.
Yeah. And we wanted to end on this note about thinking about care, the root of the word curator, the work that Dr. Rayford herself, as a scholar of African American studies and American studies, does in her classrooms, whether they're taught online, please sign up for the Freedom Summer course, or whether she's working with her undergrad and graduate students on exhibitions that they have a hand in actually caring for and curating. And I think we'll follow up another time, maybe later on this summer or in the fall, to talk about care as it relates to the work of the curator, as it relates to also the future of museums, which is something we wanted to talk about as well. Last word.
Thank you all. Take care of yourselves and each other.
Thank you, Lee.
Thanks,
Thank
Cheryl.
you. Bye.